What's up guys, Flipmaster's coming at you with a new video, and today I'll be ranking all 40 winning games of Survivor. Now first things first, I don't have any specific criteria that I'm going to follow to a T. However, the big thing I will look at is how much of the three assets of the game did they dominate. Like how good were they socially, especially next to their competition, how good were they in challenges and camp life, and of course how are they positioned throughout the game along with the big moves they pulled off. However, some things I might just outweigh more than others. Like there's winners who are far better socially than other winners, but that's really all they had to offer was their social game and nothing else. So while people who view social game as the biggest part of their criteria, for me, I need more than that. Now the big gray area in these rankings, especially when it comes to the physical part of the game, is immunity wins and idols and how to judge them. I know guys like BML get a lot of hate in the way he looks at this, basically saying that if you need to win immunities and use advantages to get to the end, you've done something wrong and should be penalized for it. So the way I look at it is this: if you're a guy like Mike Holloway who needs to win 5 immunities plus an idol to get to the end, that's a problem, as you're pretty much on the outside for half the game with nobody liking you. However, if you're a guy like JT who needs those final couple immunities, I don't really mind that. In fact, I might even respect the fact that they take the physical part of the game into their own hands to win immunity, as a guy like JT is such a great player and a massive threat, he damn well should be targeted. And good on his castmates for not being idiots and realizing that. And speaking of the cast, that is the big difference that you'll see in my rankings, is that I am taking into account the cast and when you played. So unfortunately, some of these old school players may be a little low to some people, as while they still had to do a lot, they did have to face all the adversity some of these new school winners had to face. And the big one, if you're a returning player, you're going to be penalized, because not only do you have a feel for the game, but in some cases, you're going against a bunch of newbies, or in other cases, you're going in with one of the lowest targets on your bats compared to other returning players. So it's not really a fair fight, so for that it's not fair to rank them any higher than newbie winners who did have a fair fight, in my opinion. And one other thing I do consider in these rankings is luck. Now again, all winners get a lucky break in some way or another, but winners who got a break that 99% of the time doesn't happen, I'm going to have to knock them for it. So with all that to say, let's get this list started off with number 40, and we begin with easily the worst winner in Survivor history, and that is Chris Underwood. And to be honest, I always really question people who don't have him at the bottom. I mean, obviously there's a flaws of getting voted out third and only playing a third of the game, but even the stuff he gets credit for, I don't really find all that impressive. Like, I'll give him credit for the final 6, surviving without the necklace, and getting Lauren to play her idol on him. That was definitely the best thing he did out there. But again, the people on the edge told him that he had to throw a challenge, as they wouldn't be impressed if he got to the end by winning out. So if it wasn't for that advice, I could have very well seen him winning the challenge, and potentially losing votes. And then of course giving up the final 4 necklace. I mean, I think that's a pretty obvious move, especially considering how much of a basic lock he was to win fire, as he was the best one out there, which I guess you do have to give him credit for. But to me, it's such an easy move to make, and to this day I still can't believe that Natalie didn't do the same thing in Winners at War. But yeah, in the end, no matter what he did, it really wouldn't matter, as he was voted out, which is something these 39 other winning games can't say. And hopefully we'll never have another winner like this. Now at number 39, we have the worst winning game of a Survivor player that wasn't voted out, and that is Amber Brkich. And to me, it's one thing to be a follower in a strategic way, as we'll talk about this on the list, but I think Rob could have told Amber to jump off a cliff and she would have done it. I mean, she just did nothing by herself, and she didn't follow along Rob in a strategic manner thinking she could beat him in the end. She simply fell in love with him, did whatever he said, and he did all the work to get them to the end. So in my eyes, Amber is definitely one of the weakest winners of the show, and again, only above Chris because she never got voted out. Now at number 38, we have the winner of Survivor Gabon, Bob Crowley. And you know, first things first, you have to give credit to Bob for winning 3 immunity challenges, especially knowing he needed them each time, and give credit to the relationship he made with Sugar to save him at the final 4, and all the relationships he made with Coda, as despite literally admitting he didn't do anything strategically, he still got all their votes. But that's the problem with Bob. He literally did nothing in the game, even when knowing he was on the bottom. And the one strategic thing he did in creating the fake immunity idol almost cost him the game, as he made a fake idol for his own ally in Randy, for basically no other reason than to try and find a way in with Fong, hoping that embarrassing the hated Randy would make him more liked. This obviously didn't help Bob's place in the game, and it almost caused Randy to vote for Susie. So for being on the bottom all game and accepting that fact, and almost causing himself to lose the deciding vote in Randy for basically no strategic reason, it's only for his clutch immunity run and bonds he made with certain people out there that keep him above Amber. Now at number 37, we have the winner of Survivor Nicaragua, Fabio Birza. And I still don't really know what to make of Fabio, as yes, he played up being a doofus, but at the same time, he was pretty clueless throughout the game. He was on the outside of the Shannon vote, and on the outside in general of the La Flora tribe, and he was on the outside of many of the merge votes, such as Marty and Benry's blind side. And while I do credit him for winning those final 3 immunities and 4 overall, that's still a long time to be on the bottom. But the massive problem I have with Fabio is that he only won because of Nyanka and Purple Kelly, who shouldn't have even been on the jury in the first place. And that lucky break caused him to not only get to the end as he moved up 2 spots, but it's also really bad in my opinion that he would have lost to Chase if it wasn't for that. I mean, going into the final tribal council, I thought Fabio had it in the bag, as how could you not want to vote for the fun-loving Fabio over the flip-flopping, word-breaking Chase? So to me, that's a sign that people did indeed not take him seriously, with people like Marty and Dan voting for him not because they thought of Fabio's anything great or anything, but they just simply hated Chase and Sash so much. So for me, while I do respect Fabio's 4 immunity wins and his lay-low attitude at the final 7 to save himself over Benry, he was pretty clueless throughout the game, needed the extremely lucky break of Kelly and Nyanka both quitting to not only get to the end, but to win the game as well. So for me, while I want to put him higher and think of him as this insanely good Survivor winner that fooled everyone, I just can't. Now to close out the bottom 5, we have the first real surprise winner in Survivor history, and that is Jenna Morasca. Now Jenna, I think when looking at her game, is actually pretty underrated. You know, she did win 4 immunity challenges, which is still tied for the all-time record. She did control the original ladies tribe with Heidi and Shauna, and when the tribe swap happened, she formed a relationship with Rob, and that alliance would dominate the merge. And you could argue that being a swimsuit model, she was probably in the worst position to start the game, being on an all-ladies tribe, so good on her for overcoming that. But the one thing that I cannot get over is the fact that she wanted to quit. And you know, say what you will about it being the moment, but to literally stop playing the game the second she was blindsided is such a bad look on her part and Survivor's part as a whole. And had it not been for her essentially giving up, she would have been basically guaranteed to go home at the final 5 instead of Heidi. And another factor is Chrissy's terrible gameplay at the final 6, as had she just given Rob a name, Heidi goes home in that spot, and then more than likely Jenna goes home at 5, or even worse, she could have been voted out at 6 after she had given up her necklace. So for me, her giving up at the final 6 was not gameplay, it was basically her giving up, and she greatly benefited from a terrible blunder from Christy as well. So while I think Jenna's game is underrated, I can't look past the fact that she only survived those 6 and 5 rounds due to her quitting attitude, an attitude that no winner has ever had, so she lands here at 36. Now at number 35, we have a winner who at the time was hated, but is now considered to be among the best players in Survivor. However, that doesn't change the fact that their winning game was very weak, and that is Michele Fitzgerald. And here's the thing with Michele, yes, she's phenomenal socially, possibly one of the best of all time. She won immunities and advantages when she had to, but she just got so many lucky breaks. She was literally going to be the first boot on the original Beauty tribe, and was going to be the first boot after the swap, but never went to tribal in the pre-merge. Her first tribal was damn near almost after half the cast had been eliminated. And had it not been for Joe stuffing his face full of meat and being evacuated, she would have gone home at 5, as the final 4 reward challenge was almost certainly to be the final 5 immunity, which Michele obviously didn't win. So between going home had she gone to literally any of the pre-merge tribal councils, or had Joe been 20 years younger, she goes home at the final 5 as well. And she only attended 6 tribal councils in all, the lowest ever for a winner. So while that's an extreme amount of luck in the game, she is above these other winners for her great social skills, as she would have beat anyone in the final 5, and find a way in the majority at the merge despite being so on the outs in the pre-merge. So in the end, I think 35 is a good spot for her. Now at 34 is a player who I know most people have right above Chris, and might have the same opinion in that he should be automatically at 39 because of a certain twist. But here at 34, I have Ben Driebergen. And this is the thing with Ben. For literally 2/3 of the game, he wasn't just in a good spot, but he had full control over everything. He also played his fake alliance to perfection at the final 9 and 8 rounds, which led to 2 great blindsides of JP and Joe. But this obviously led to him being turned on in the final 7 and needing idols for the next 3 rounds. And like I said, while I don't particularly like that he was on the bottom for that long, give credit to him for playing such a big time game, and credit to the rest of the cast for realizing this and going after him. And while the final 5 idol was obviously suspicious, give credit to Ben for playing his ass off to find the idols. And that's another thing, he played his ass off all 39 days, whether he was at the top or bottom, while the other players were for some reason so sure he didn't have an idol that they themselves didn't even bother looking for idols. Now of course the big problem a lot of people have with Ben is the unexpected fire making challenge. And here's the thing, while I do penalize Ben for this, as he goes home in any other season, I don't think this was quote unquote rigged for him. as I think this is always going to be put in, especially after we had seen players such as Kelly, David, and Ty go down without a fight in previous seasons. So while I do absolutely take away from Ben's endgame like most people do, I can't put him behind some of these other winners when he completely dominated the first month of the game and continued to play hard when he was at the bottom. And I don't think the fire making challenge was rigged for him. But at the end of the day, he is voted out on day 38 had this been any other season, so I can't put him much higher than 34. Now coming in at number 33 is a very similar winner to Ben in terms of a late game run, and that is Mike Holloway, winner of Worlds Apart. And again, similar to Ben, he dominated the first half of the game on both his pre-merge tribes and when the merge first started. However, after his blunder with the final 9, everyone turned against him, and for basically the next half of the game, he was on the bottom, and would have gone home each time had he not won immunity or had an idol. But even though he was on the bottom longer than Ben, and quite frankly didn't play as dominant as Ben, I do respect his immunity run, as he did tie an all-time record, and immunity challenges have always been a part of Survivor, where immunity idols haven't, and obviously forced fire making is a very new thing in Survivor. So while I do think Ben played the better game while on the top, and Mike was in danger longer than Ben, I think winning 5 immunities is much more respectable than 3 idols in a fire making challenge, which is why he's above Ben, though still a bottom tier winner. Now at 32, we once again have someone that may seem a little high to some, and I'm sure for a while she was unanimously thought of as the weakest winner, but over time I think people have come to appreciate her game for what it is, and that is Natalie White. And Natalie is somebody that didn't play a dominating game, obviously, but she played the game she knew she had to play for herself, and that was riding to the end with Russell and Mick, knowing she could beat them in a jury vote. And what makes her better than someone like Amber is that she was doing this strategically. I mean, granted, Fofo was down in numbers, so they were kind of forced to stick together. But either way, she knew she could beat Russell, and stayed in his good graces all the way until the end. And not to mention, I think in some ways she pulled off a franchise-changing move in the Eric blindside, showing off her social skills. As if Galoo sticks to Jason, the rest of Fofo are picked off, as the glue would now have enough to split the votes. But while she did play the game she needed to play, obviously it wasn't a dominant game, as besides the Eric blindside, Russell basically did all the work in finding the idols, getting Shambo and John to flip, and he could have cut her any time, but thought she was an easy beat at the end, to which you could give her credit for, but to me, I think this is a feeling most of the jury had, as going in, Mick was actually the favorite to win by the jury, but Natalie swayed the votes over her way. So while I do respect Natalie's game, it's simply not a dominant one, and she did rely a ton on someone else as opposed to herself. So while it's a shame she got as much hate as she did for her win, it's still not a great win by any stretch of the imagination. Now at number 31, I have someone that I didn't really know what to do with. I ended up putting this person lower than probably most people would, especially considering how freaking lovable he is, and that is Ethan Zohn. And it's so interesting because while Ethan was in the majority alliance all game, that's really all he did. And credit to his phenomenal social game that nobody ever turned on him. But I don't know, man. He kind of feels like the Drew Daniel Survivor in terms of an easy path to victory. And I'm not taking anything away from Ethan for making it 39 days in those brutal conditions, as most people couldn't even make it one day out there in Kenya. But again, this is a problem with a lot of old school winners who play without advantages. If you got into a solid majority, you had a pretty easy ride to the final couple days of the game. And with the first ever tribe swap, and the first case of pre-merge annoyance of the original Samaru tribe, the Braun Alliance was always going to take control at the merge, to which of course Ethan was a part of. Despite this though, they did actually almost screw it up after gunning for Kelly, which almost resulted in a Lex blindside, but luckily for the Baran Alliance, Brandon made an all-time bad move in voting with the Barans. And so this brings the Baran 4 alliance of Tom, Ethan, Kim, and Lex to the final 4. And this is where some people would give credit to Ethan, in that he didn't need immunities to get to the end, but to me, he gets really lucky in that a 56-year-old woman was able to win 2 immunity challenges and take him to the end. Cause here's the thing, had Ethan won immunities, specifically the last one, he loses the game, as he was planning on taking Lex to the end with him, which he would have lost to. And that's another thing, the fact that Kim chose to take Ethan over Lex, despite Lex clearly making enemies out there, and the fact that a guy like Lex beats an incredibly likable guy like Ethan, is really a big knock against Ethan, especially in this old school era where aggressive game players like Lex were usually despised by the jury. And in general, I think Ethan, similar to Natalie, took a backseat to Lex in the strategic part of the game, whether good or bad, and put way too much of his game, especially in the post-merge, into Lex's hands. So a 56-year-old woman winning the final 2 immunities ended up being the best case scenario for Ethan, even more so than him winning, combined with the fact that he took a backseat to Lex and loses to him at the end. and just in general, he had an extremely easy road to the Final Four. So with the lack of dominance and lucky endgame in which he actively would have gone against, makes me unfortunately have to put him pretty low at number 31. Now at number 30, we have the winner of Survivor Guatemala, Danni Boatwright, who I think is an interesting one to rank, as she was in the majority on her original Nakum tribe, and was the one in complete control on the new Yasha tribe. But she was relegated to the bottom at the merge, and was really the only one left standing due to 1, her being the least threatening, and 2, Rafe and Stephanie pulling a move on Jamie before going back to the Pagonging, and had it been the usual Pagonging, more than likely Danni goes at 7. But she is able to survive until the final 6 and win a clutch immunity, which did turn her whole game around, as to her credit, she did find a way into the majority at the final 6, and got Steph and Rafe to take out not only Sydney at 5, but unbelievably take out Lydia over Danni at 4. But a big knock I have against Danni is that final immunity challenge, which was extremely unfair in her favor. And, obviously Danni is a great competitor, but had this been any other how bad do you want to final immunity challenge, I'm almost certain Steph wins that and takes Rafe with her to the end. So Danni's an interesting one to rank, as she played pretty damn well for a good portion of the game, but during her time on the bottom, I think she was the least thought of out of the bunch, and only made it to 6 due to Jamie's terrible gameplay. Plus, 9 times out of 10, she used the day 38 boot, but got a challenge that was extremely in her favor. So while Danni is an underrated winner, she definitely wasn't dominated, and got some massive lucky breaks in the end game due to bad gameplay and a challenge flaw, so she lands here at 30. Now at 29, we have someone who is the complete opposite of some of these previous winners, and that this person was never in full control for long periods of the game, but their moves were a lot bigger, didn't rely on a glaring lucky break, and competed in a season full of twists and turns with some incredible competition. And that person is the winner of Survivor Millennials vs. Gen X, Adam Klein. And let's go through Adam's game, because it was a wild one. First of all, he starts the game at the bottom of the Millennials tribe after the Mari blindside, and was lucky he didn't have to go to another tribal council with the Millennials, because more than likely, he would have had to use his idol. I mean, to be fair though, he did ultimately end up wasting his idol at the final 9, but still. But the good stuff is that after the tribe swap, he made the right move and flipped it to the Gen Xers of Ken and Jessica, and ultimately formed a bond with the two, which would lead them to joining David's alliance, which took a stranglehold on the game at the final 9 after Will's flip. I know a lot of people downplay Adam's game due to his call at the merge about the Steel Award and not confronting Taylor about it, but to me, it was kind of a last gasp effort by Taylor, and going on Adam for not only having his allies stay loyal to him, but for feeling so secure that he didn't even use his idol in the first couple of tribals after the merge. When David's alliance finally broke up with Final 5, he was on the outside of the first vote, but I don't fault him for that, as it was clearly the right move to get rid of David, and not put him so close to the end. And so while I would punish people like Ken and Hannah had they won for taking such an unnecessary risk, I won't punish Adam, nor do I blame him for wasting his idol at 5, as it was the last time he could use it, although if he could do it over again, he probably should have used it on Brett. And that's Adam's game for you. He made the right call a lot of times, but it just simply didn't work out. Like playing 2 idols incorrectly, but it made complete sense why he did so, being on the wrong end of some votes, and simply just not being as trustworthy as some other people in his alliance out there. But he did have a great sense of game awareness. And so while I do think it's unfair to fault him for some certain things during his game, he was obviously never a dominant figure in his alliance, and while I do think he made the correct moves at times, they just simply didn't work out, and unfortunately his game is just too messy to rank him any higher than 29. Now at number 28, I have the first of Sandra's 2 winning games, her winning game in Survivor Pearl Islands. And first off, the big issue I have is that she was literally seconds away from being the first boot. I mean, had Morgan not stumbled at the finish line, she's just a forgotten first boot in Survivor history, which is crazy to think about. However, she did a great job of finding a way into the tribe, of course siding with the Krista and Rupert side of things, where she was in a good position until the merge. But at the merge, she was simply outplayed by Fair Play, as he blindsided her 2 closest allies and Rupert at 8, and Krista at 6. Now she did get the best of him at the final 5, blindsided his closest ally in Burton, to which basically guaranteed herself the final 3, as John and Darrow were the 2 biggest threats going into the final 4. However, similar to Danni, while the final 3 challenge wasn't exactly unfair, it was a massive lucky break for Sandra that happened to be the one endurance challenge that Lil could beat Fair Play in, as again, 9 times out of 10, Fair Play easily beats both Lil and Sandra in the How Bad Do You Want It Final Immunity Challenge. And that's just bad to me that she relied on a 50-year-old woman in Lil who happened to be good on squats to not only beat John, but eliminate him as well. And this was not really a game move by Lil either, since Lil knew she would lose to both of them, and would rather lose to Sandra than John. So there is a lot of bad in Sandra's game here, as she was super close to being the first boot, was blindsided multiple times by Fair Play, and got super lucky that Lil not only won the Final Immunity Challenge, but took her to the end. However, what puts her above someone like Danni, who had similar flaws, was that Sandra was the one to make some of the big moves herself, where Danni had to solely rely on Steph and Rafe. Like, she blamed her own ally Krista for the lost fish and putting the target on her back. She was part of the majority alliance that threw a challenge to get rid of Burton, and of course her brilliant move on Burton once again blindsided him at 5, guaranteeing herself the final 3. And another thing I factored was that Fairplay was only able to outplay Sandra due to Burton getting a second chance in the game, with the Outcast twist obviously being one of the most unfair twists in Survivor history. Now granted, who knows how Sandra's game would have gone without this twist, but at the end of the day, her game is very messy like Adam, and not super dominant with some lucky breaks like Danni. But for me, the moves she made to get to the end were far more impressive, and came within 1 vote of a perfect game. So she lands right above Danni and Adam, here at 28. Now at 27, we have another interesting person to rank, and that is the winner of Survivor Philippines, Denise Stapley. Now of course she survived every tribal council in the game, an amazing feat, but other than that, her game is okay at best. She started off the game in a dominant position on Mat Singh, of course with Malcolm, and while she did survive on Kalaba, it wasn't due to really anything she did. It was mostly due to all the problems they had with Katie and Dawson. Then at the merge, she did do a good job of fitting in with the majority along with Malcolm, and at the final 9, her alliance took over the game. The big knock I have against her is her endgame. At the final 5, Scoop and Lisa made an unbelievably bad decision of keeping Denise over Abby, thinking they needed Denise to beat Malcolm, who was the real competition, as opposed to Denise, which obviously was a disastrous decision, as taking Abby with them to the end was the only chance either of them had in winning. 99% of the time, Denise goes home in that spot. Then at the final 4, she was willing to work with Malcolm and take him to the end with her, a flat out $1 million mistake as Malcolm beats her in the end. And luckily, due to once again another baffling move, Malcolm said no, which gave Denise no other choice but to vote him out, which ultimately won her the game. So while she did an unreal feat of surviving every tribal counts, again, absolutely incredible, take nothing away from that, and she was in the majority throughout most of the game, a lot of her game, other than her time on Mat Singh, she wasn't in control and the one making the moves. She just kind of got by. And in Denise's endgame, she got a bunch of lucky breaks, which involved Lisa and Scoop making an all-time bad move and keeping her over Abby, along with the fact that Denise herself was willing to make an awful move and keeping Malcolm, to which Malcolm actively went against. And it just so happens that her bad move was the one that didn't go through and got her the win. So to me, while her game on paper is impressive, and in the beginning she was in a real good spot, it was more of the Malcolm, Lisa, Scoopin, and Penners of the world who were in charge of the game, with Denise just getting by, and a combination of terrible moves which she was also part of. I think she sort of just fell into a win, as opposed to controlling her win. So to me, despite her never say die attitude, which you have to respect, she ultimately lands here at number 27. Now we have the second of Sandra's 2 winning games, and that is her game in Heroes vs. Villains. And yeah, I think her 2 games are pretty similar, in that she had a lot of good moves in her game, although there is some obvious flaws. Now first of all, her only winning game was in a scenario that she was in, next to the extremely hated Russell and his ally and fellow winner Parvati, and she was actively against that for most of the game. Like Tyson switching his vote and getting himself voted out, putting Sandra's alliance with Rob at the bottom, was probably a blessing in disguise for her, as I don't see a final 3 scenario in which she wins in that Rob alliance. And when the merge hit, she wanted to flip on Russell, who was literally going to take her to the end and would end up beating him. Now to be fair, she never actually goes through with it, and that's a massive credit I do give her, is that she downplayed her game to the jury. Like, they wanted to hear how she tried to warn them about Russell, and wanted to hear how she hated him like they hated Russell. So that was a phenomenal job on her part playing to the jury, and is really the first and only winner to ever strategically downplay their game. She also basically saved herself at the final 12 with the coach lie. Now to be fair, I'm not sure if Russell would have blindsided Coach at 12 had the Heroes not been convinced it was a women's alliance, but it was still great on Sandra's part to put that out there. But again, going with Russell was never her plan, until she realized that would win her the game. And while I do respect her for realizing this, and I think she did a great job of pandering to the jury, I don't think she did much herself to get to the end, like she did in Pearl Islands. She was carried by Russell, who had a bad read on her. And while you have to give credit to Sandra for taking advantage of his bad read, it was still his best option, as again Jerry and the Heroes were all bigger threats than Sandra, with maybe only Danielle being less of a jury threat than Sandra. But the reason why she's 2 spots above her Pearl Islands game is that I don't think the flaws she had in this game are as blatant as she had in the Pearl Islands. As again, she could have been the first one out, was blindsided multiple times, and was lucky that Lil of all people won the final immunity challenge. Where in this game, while she didn't do anything super great other than the coach blindside, she still was in a good spot for pretty much the entire game, despite it being a weak player and one of the only winners on the cast. And she played the endgame so interestingly, in that she played with the villains despite being against them, which the Heroes loved. So while her game isn't as flashy as her Pro Islands game, her overall game wasn't as blatantly flawed as her previous outing, and for that matter, Denise's game as well. So she lands here at 26. Now at 25, we have in my eyes probably one of the most underrated winners in Survivor history, and that is Vecepia Towery. Now the great thing with V is that she really was not only the first winner, but the first player in Survivor history to realize the spot she was in, and that staying with the tribe that was outnumbered wouldn't get her anywhere. And especially at a time where there were no idols, her best move was siding with the majority and hoping she could survive as long as she could until they turned on each other. And that's exactly what happened. And when she was on the outside of votes, she wasn't the one that was being targeted, while Rob and Sean were. Then at the final four, she played flawlessly. Even people who take away from immunity wins had to admit that this was as well earned as it gets, as she studied other people throughout the game, knowing this how well do you know your jury challenge would come, and won immunity when she had to. Then at the final three, she pulled a reverse hatch and agreed to a final two deal on the spot, turning on Kathy right away. Now again, I made a video on this before, but had this been any other season with a fire making challenge, she has literally no way of winning at that point, but still, she played the game she had to play in that era almost perfectly. The problem is, she needed a lot of things to go right. Like, it wasn't any of her doing and getting Natalie and Pascal to flip, it was mostly the bad gameplay of the Road 2-4. And again, while she played the endgame phenomenally, if there was a fire-making challenge, or any tie-breaking challenge in general which forces either Natalie or Kathy to go home, she doesn't win, as Kathy and Pascal both beat her in the final two, and if it was a Natalie, Pascal, and Vecepia final three, I'm 99% sure that Natalie would beat Vecepia in that final immunity challenge, seeing she was better conditioned and nearly 20 years younger, and would obviously take Pascal with her to the final two. So in pretty much every season with a tie-breaking Final Four challenge, and for that matter any other season in the old school era, Vecepia doesn't win, which is why she is this low on my list, which is a shame too, because I think she is such an underrated winner and player. Now at 24, we have one of my personal favorite winners, but I still think there's a lot of flaws in his game, and that is Chris Daugherty. And the thing with Chris is that he flat out made what looked to be $1 million mistake in keeping Twilight and Julie over John, which of course led to the woman dominating the game. Now I will give him credit for being the last man standing, as I don't think that was because he was seen as the weakest. I think it was due to the social connections and bonds he made with the woman. However, that brings me to another flaw in his game. I think a lot of people give him credit for getting the women to flip on each other, when in reality, that was all Scout and Twyla. Chris really only got Eliza to flip and get on board with the plan. And this flip is obviously what propelled him to the top, and basically falling into a swing vote spot the rest of the way between the Twyla Scout duo and the woman now on the bottom in Julie, Amy, and eventually Eliza. And again, while he dominated the endgame, which included 2 immunity wins, he didn't actually do anything himself to put him in a good spot. It was the ladies turning to each other at just the right time that put him in a good spot the rest of the way. And again, the only reason why he was in a bot spot to begin with was due to his bad move at the final 11. But at the end of the day, he dominated the pre-merge, won some clutch immunities, and it was great socially that he was able to make it as the last man standing. But he put himself in a bad position at the merge, and really fell into a good position at the endgame, as opposed to putting himself in a good position. So I think Chris is a super well-rounded player. His winning game does have some flaws, which lands him here at 24. Now at 23, we have the first winner of many return player winners on the list who dropped significantly due to the unfair advantage they had, with this winner I believe having the easiest road to victory of them all, and that is Cochran's winning game in Survivor Caramoan. And first things first, he dominated the game. He won 3 immunities and was a swing vote on the original favorites tribe. It took complete control of the game at the merge, with his alliance of Dawn and Sherry pulling off some amazing blindsides on the likes of Andrea and Brenda. But come on, look at his competition. I mean, the fans tribe has to be some of the worst casting of all time, as none of them were there to play other than maybe Reynolds and Matt, and honestly none of them really stood a chance. And look at his favorite counterparts. Philip and Brendan were freaking crazy and never going to win. Francesco was always going to be the first boot due to pregame alliances, and nobody knew who Malcolm was. Cochran was clearly in the best position to win with his pregame alliance and going against a terrible fan tribe. But at the end of the day, he pulled off a win in a dominating fashion and beats anyone at the end as well. And in general, he played a perfect game. But to me, nobody has ever gone in with such an easier path to victory than Cochran. And so while his game is pretty much perfect, I simply have to penalize him. And ultimately, I think number 23 is a good spot for Cochran. Now in 22, we have another return player who pretty much also had a free ride to the end. And so while their game could be considered the best of all time by some people, I'm going to have to penalize them pretty badly. And that is Boston Rob's win in Redemption Island. And yeah, right away, he was a 4-time player playing with a bunch of newbies with Redemption Island as a backup. Now I will say, I actually do give him the slightest edge over Cochran. Because 1, his gameplay was just simply much more dominating than Cochran. And 2, I do think had Zapateras gotten the numbers at the merge, he more than likely doesn't win the game. And pulling off the map blindside to ensure the numbers the rest of the way was a tribal war. Had something gone wrong there, Zapatera could have taken over, as they were obviously against Robin Russell, and simply much more game savvy than the fans tribe in Karamoan. And you also have to give credit to Rob for leading his tribe to those pre-merge immunity challenge victories in order to get the numbers at the merge. And I mean, honestly, you could really flip-flop Cochran and Rob, as they both were basically gifted a win on a silver platter. But Rob was simply much more dominant than the Cochran, and even though he was facing all newbies, over half the newbies were in fact against him. It's just that the people that were on his side were literally glued to him. So when you combine getting the game on a silver platter with a dominant performance, I think you get an average placement, so he lands here at 22. Now at 21, we have one of my favorite winners, but one that was pretty messy at times, and that is Nick Wilson, winner of Survivor Day vs. Goliath. Now first and foremost, one could say he could be really low, as he was lucky not to be the first boot. But since the season ended, it's been speculated that Pat and even Lyrsa were more likely to be targets at that first tribal council. And considering what a great player Nick ended up being, I'm willing to bet he makes it out of that tribal, even if his name was being thrown out there. He and Christian then took over the Davids at the Jessica blindside, and then he and Mike formed a close bond on Jabeni, a bond that would ultimately lead them to the end of the game, although I do think Mike was the one more in charge. Then at the final 12, he was the one to come up with the minority split vote plan, one of the best moves in Survivor history. I mean, so at this point, Nick's game's up there as one of the best of all time, but his game does go down at the final 9 when he starts to play a bit messy. Now, I don't fault him for being blindsided at the final 9, as I think it was definitely the wrong move to take out Carl right after the Davids finally took over the numbers, but the final 7 and 6 rounds were pretty bad, as he was completely clueless and wasting his idol at 7 when he didn't even receive a vote, and at the final 6, his final 3 alliance didn't even trust him to tell him of the Davy plan. Now, he did clutch up and win 3 immunities, which was impressive, even more so since he didn't need any of them, maybe other than the final 5, but I think he only goes home there if Allison wins. So Nick played one of the most interesting games in Survivor history, as he pulled off some incredible moves, but at the same time, he was messy throughout the game. He was in trouble early, wasn't in complete control of the Jabeni drive, and was really clueless at the final 7 and 6 rounds. I did actually have him around where I had Adam, due to his messy gameplay, but the more I thought about it, his game was much more impressive than Adam's, as despite his messy gameplay, he wasn't in that much danger of ever going home, won 3 immunities, and had more winning scenarios than Adam. So when you combine Nick's great gameplay with his messy gameplay, I think 21 is a good spot to land him. Now at number 20, we're going back to the old school era, and at 20, I have the winner of the Australian Outback, Tina Wesson. So right away, you're probably wondering why I have Tina so much higher than Ethan, and the reason being is that she played the game much harder and played from the bottom. Now, some people would usually take away from the fact that she was on the bottom, but to me, the fact that she went from the bottom to the top in season freaking 2 is flat out insane. Especially considering she got Colby of all people to flip to, as we saw later this season, this guy was as loyal as a player could be, even if that meant costing him the game. And the fact she got Colby to flip to save Keith of all people, as ironic as that is, against the Mitchell, Jerry, and Amber trio, which was really the first ever flip in Survivor history, is really impressive, as that move is literally the move that would get Tina to the final 3 with Colby and Keith. Now again, there is the same problem with Tina that I had with Ethan, and that in a way it was almost too easy for that threesome to get to the end, especially after Ogrecore took over the numbers at the merge. But she still controlled the merge and ultimately won over the jury against the American boy and Colby. And she was the one to get the Ogrecores to flip on both Amber and Jerry. And while I think flipping against Amber at that point was kind of unnecessary, her taking out Jerry was phenomenal, as this was received so well by the Kuchas, and Jerry took it more personally against Colby as opposed to Tina, as we saw in the jury vote. Now, I do think she gets really lucky that Colby takes it to the end, as that wasn't a Tony-type move by Tina where she did a lot of good campaigning. That was straight up Colby doing what he felt was right, so she got extremely fortunate there, as 99% of the time she was the one to go home in that spot. So while she was similar to Ethan in that she was in a down position and stayed with her dominant alliance until the end, she proved she could play from the bottom, and basically by herself flipped not only her game, but the entire season of the Outback at the Mitchell Boo. It was in control of her alliance throughout the rest of the game, steering the blindsides of Amber and Jerry, and her social game won her votes over another great social player in Colby, who also won 5 immunity challenges, which is super impressive. So while there's so much I love about Tina's game, it was still only season 2, and it's hard to put her over some of these other winners who had so much more to deal with. At number 19, we're now in the upper half of the list, and staying in line with the old school winners, we have the oldest of them all, Richard Hatch, winner of Survivor Borneo. And for me, while he never played from the bottom like Tina, he was also not just riding along like Ethan. He was a flat-out dominant player in Survivor's first ever season. Now, obviously, since he and Sue were really the only players that were game-savvy that season, he could be penalized since he had an easy ride to victory, but even Rich didn't know about things such as jury management, how the show would be perceived, and whatnot. So for him to play the way he did in a villainous way and still win the game over a likable woman and challenge Beast in Wigglesworth, in my eyes deserves big recognition. It's debatable who really started the Toggy Alliance, but Rich was definitely the centerpiece of it. He also wanted to pull off the first flip and backstab in her history on Wigglesworth, but she kept winning immunity challenges. He used Sean's alphabet strategy to the Toggy's forward advantage, and of course pulled off the all-time memorable move, stepping down from the immunity challenge, knowing he would be taken either way to the final two. And even though I would look at that as a bad thing that he couldn't put faith in his own hands, I do think he beats Rudy in the end as well. I mean, it's really close either way. It proves even more how impressive Rich's game was, that a cocky guy can not only beat Wigglesworth, but might have even beaten Rudy as well. So Rich played a flat-out dominant game in Borneo, and while some of the physical and social elements of his game might not have been great, and obviously the competition was subpar, you can't take away from what he did out there. So he lands here at 19. Now at 18, we have a very interesting winner to assess, and that is Wendell Holland, winner of Survivor Ghost Island. And it's one of those things where he dominated the game, but he dominated it with another player. And had it not been for some unnecessary gameplay and a terrible final tribal council performance, Dom would have won the season. And that's really all I can say about Wendell. I mean, yes, he dominated the game, but he didn't do it by himself like other winners, and he came so close to losing. Now, credit where credit's due. He wasn't as much out there as Dominic was on the original Navidi tribe, possibly making him a target. He was a challenge threat. His idol play in Laurel is ultimately what won him the game, and he showed massive game awareness at the middle of the merge when his name was out there, but he didn't play his idol, and he didn't need to. So, I mean, all of that is really good and makes him stand out from Dom. But I just don't think he could have played this dominant game without Dominic, and just the tiniest of better gameplay from Dom, and Wendell doesn't win this season. So Wendell played an amazing game, but I can't quite put him in the top tier dominant winners, so he lands here at 18. Now at number 17, we have in my eyes one of the most underrated Survivor winners and players in history, and I'm so glad they showed off their skills at Winners at War, and that is Sophie Clarke. And she played a dominant game in such a non-dominant fashion, which is just so interesting to watch. She basically solidified herself with the majority alliance on day one, but unlike the other players who were actually drawn in by Coach, she was doing it all for strategy. And once Apollo took over the merge, instead of just making moves for the sake of moves, she actually stopped people like Albert from making those unnecessary moves and realized she could beat Coach and Albert in the end. She also won 3 immunities with possibly one of the most clutch wins of all time, and beating the challenge beast Ozzy, who had won so many challenges to earn his way back. You'd think it'd be a foregone conclusion he would win the last one, but Sophie pulled through. And the fact that she read Coach so well and went with him to the end is such an amazing read, especially after all these players saw Boston Rob completely dominate the season before. And while she was second in command, the reason why I have her so much higher than players like Natalie and Ethan was that she was really the centerpiece of the majority 5 and keeping things in control, while Coach was the leader just based on who he was. And Sophie strategically played herself as second in command, but in reality was the one winning challenges and keeping the alliance together. Again, she played second in command and leader at the same time. It's just so massively done. Now her flaws, one is that she needed that final 3 scenario. I mean, she even loses to Brandon freaking Hans in that endgame. And she didn't really have any other options to play with, which to be fair is why I love her non-aggressive attitude, but again, with only 2 people you can win against, that gives you very little wiggle room, and it just takes one challenge, immediate idol, and a whole bunch of wacky things to ruin things for Sophie, into which she wouldn't be able to recover from, and you have to, discredit her game for that. But in the end, her game is just so interesting and articulate in South Pacific, and I think it definitely deserves her a spot at number 17. Now, the next 3 winners I have are all dominant winners who are in most people's top 10, but unfortunately, they're all returning players. And while they weren't as blatantly obviously protected as Rob and Cochran, they still had an obvious advantage as opposed to the other 2 returning player winners who are at the top of my list, and the newbie winners. The first one here at number 16 is the winner of Survivor Micronesia, Parvati Shallow. And to me, Parvati was in one of the best spots coming into the game, as people like Fairplay, Eliza, James, and Yaman were never going to win this season with the targets they had on their back. And obviously the Fans Tribe, while much better than the Fans Tribe in Karamoan, were still playing against a bunch of veterans, putting them at an unfair advantage, leaving Parvati in one of the best spots to win the game from the start. But even with that, she was nearly the first boot, and thanks to Fairplay quitting, she was able to survive the first tribal council. And then the other massive flaw is the fact that she was actively willing to go to the final 3 with Suri and Amanda, and while it is a close vote, Cirie does win. So Parvati was actually playing to lose, but was once again massively benefited by an incredibly fortunate final 2. And even then she put herself in a risky spot, as she threw the final immunity challenge. And while some people might praise this as this was like a Richard Hatch type move, as she was getting to the end no matter what, to me, she put her game literally in Amanda's hands, as even if she gets to the end with Cirie, she loses. So Parvati got extremely lucky to not be the first boot, and that there was an unexpected final 2. But she completely dominated the game. It was a part of some of the greatest blindsides in Survivor history. It was the person to form arguably the most dominant alliance in Survivor history, the Black Widow Brigade. So yes, she's an absolute dominant winner, but she also got extremely lucky. It was in one of the best positions coming into the game. So to me, her game is super hit and miss. As in one aspect, she's the leader of the Black Widows and blindside players with idols in their pocket. But then, she's also greatly benefited by twists in the game. So in the end, I think when you combine everything with Parvati's game in Micronesia with my criteria, 16 ultimately is a good spot to put her. Now the next returning player also played it against a tribe of half newbies, was greatly benefited by twists and positioning, but still dominated the game. And that person is Tyson Apostol, winner of Survivor Blood vs. Water. And yeah, he dominated the game pretty much throughout, and had a much smoother road to the final 3 than Parvati, who could have gone home at several points. However, there are some downsides to his game. Mainly the final 7 and 6 rounds, where at the final 7 he plays his idol when he gets no votes, and at the final 6 he doesn't play his idol for himself or Monica, which would have literally guaranteed them the final 3, as obviously with the way the rock draw rules work, his entire alliance would have been safe, and had the majority of the rest of the way. He put his faith into someone who literally voted out their mom in hopes she wouldn't flip. Sierra obviously did flip, and Tyson got very fortunate he wasn't the one to draw the bad rock. But the big problem I have is not only is he similar to Parvati and that he was in a great spot coming in, as people like Rupert, Colton, Cat, and even someone like Candace, who was added in at the last minute, were never going to win this season. And of course, it was once again veterans versus a bunch of newbies, which to be fair, these are probably the most competitive newbies to ever compete against veterans, but it's still obviously a massive advantage for the returning players. But the massive night that keeps Tyson below the other returning player winner in this 3-person stretch is the fact that there was Redemption Island. And obviously the challenges on Redemption Island are incredibly high variance, but Tyson is one of the best physical competitors in the show's history, and I could very easily see him winning any of those challenges to get back in the game, if he indeed would have been voted out. But still, these flaws are not as bluntly glaring as Parvati's flaws, so that's what puts him here one spot ahead of Parvati at number 15. Now the final returning player winner in this 3-person stretch, at number 14, is the winner of Survivor Game Changers, Sarah Lacina. And again, like all the other returning players so far, she was in such a good position as going into the game, people like JT, Tony, Cirie, Aubrey, and Ozzy had such massive targets on their back. But at the same time, she wasn't a complete nobody who really didn't have much of a chance to win either, like Caleb, Holly, and Sierra Dawn Thomas. But as opposed to Tyson and Parvati, that's really all the flaws she does have, as she pretty much dominated the game from beginning to end. I mean, now if I had a nitpick, I mean, she did rely on Brad in the physical part of the game, as if someone like Ty or Aubrey would have won their way to the end, more than likely they win the game. And I guess she didn't really, quote, dominate the game in the pre-merge like she did at the merge. But other than that, I mean, her game was amazing, as she pulled off some great moves like getting Sierra's legacy advantage, flipping on Debbie at the final 11, and using the legacy advantage to her advantage at the final 6, which gave her alliance of Troyson and Culpepper the numbers the rest of the way. So while she did dominate the game and didn't have nearly as many flaws as Tyson and Parvati, again, she was like one of 4 realistic options to win Game Changers. I mean, it's such a bad cast. So in the end, she gets the 14th spot on my list. Now at 13, we have one of the most dominant winners ever, but there's one massive flaw that I just can't look over, and that is Kwon, winner of the Cook Islands. And yeah, he dominated the game from beginning to end, while pretty much never being targeted, and beat a massive challenge beast in Ozzy at the final tribal council. But the big problem is that he had the massively overpowered idol all game that allowed him to play so aggressively and never be targeted. Now granted, I think he still dominates the game without the super idol, like he probably still saves Becky in the pre-merge. I still think he likely gets Penner to flip because, you know, Penner was just a bad move in general by Penner, so even super idol or not, he probably flips either way. And I still think he gets to the final 4. But the problem is, this idol literally guaranteed him to the final tribal council, since the idol went all the way to 4, and this was the first season with a final 3. Had it been the usual final 2, I think it's almost a guarantee that Ozzy wins and takes Becky to the end with him over Yule. And even at the final 4, if he didn't have an idol, which is normally the case, he would have likely gone to at least fire against Sandra. I mean, you know, to which he probably wins. But who knows, maybe he also goes home. Maybe Becky turns on him too as well for being such a massive threat. So while yes, it's unfair in a way to knock against Yule, as he was just playing with what he had in a dominant fashion, and I do think he still plays the game in a dominant fashion without the super idol, you can't overlook his powers and advantage it gave him over all the other winners. So because of that, he lands here at 13. Now at number 12, we move on to, in my eyes, probably the most underrated, or at the very least, most undeservedly hated winner, and that is Aras Baskauskas. And yes, Aras is not the most interesting winner in the world, especially on the season with the likes of Suri, Shane, and Terry. But despite all these crazy personalities on Kasaya, he managed to be the one to take control and keep them all together to dominate the merge. And while some people say he was only kept around due to his challenge powers against Terry, when they had the chance to take him out at the final 6 and final 5, he used his relationships he built with Suri and Danielle to survive each round, despite being such a massive target and threat to win. And that's another great thing about Aras, and something that I don't think a lot of people realize, is that he beats everyone on Kasaya, including Suri. And I argued that even against Terry, if somehow they took each other to the end, it's a close 4-3 vote. The big knock that people use against Aras, which I just never understood, is that had Terry lost any of the immunity challenges, Aras would have gone home, since Terry would have used his super idol on himself, and, Lacina would have put their votes on Aras. But to me, that's just silly, since again, the idol was so overpowered. How can you knock Aras for potentially going home in such an unfair way? And since Terry never did lose, we never truly got to see if Kasaya, what they would have done if Winnie would have lost. Like, maybe they would have invented the split vote this season instead of cowboying the Cook Islands. So for me, it's so impressive to see this young man completely control the wild Kasaya tribe, survive the final 6 and 5 rounds despite being such a massive target, and the fact that he beats people like Suri in the final 2 shows just how much his game was respected out there, and the arguments against him just don't have any justification in my opinion. So for all those reasons, I have Aras much higher on my list than most people, but I definitely think he deserves the 12th spot. Now at number 11, we have the first true dominant winner in Survivor history, but similar to Yule, there's one massive glaring flaw in this person's game, and that is Brian Heidik, winner of Survivor Thailand. And yeah, he literally dominated the game for pretty much hour 1. In Richard and Borneo, he was on the outs of some votes and wasn't in full control of what was going on, but everyone on Chuigon was coming to Brian and making a final 2 with him, and the tribe did pretty much whatever he said. He also won 3 immunities even though he didn't really need any of them, and was far and away the biggest physical competitor on their tribe in general. But the big problem I have with Brian is that he almost loses the game to Clay freaking Jordan. And this isn't like a 4-3 vote where the 4 votes were locked, or he loses a vote or 2 during the final tribal council. No, he came so close to losing Ted's vote, and is right up there with Wendell in terms of how close he came to losing the game. And to be honest, I don't really want to discuss it too much, but Ted's vote involved a racist comment that Brian made, and apparently he blamed it on Clay. So if that's true, Brian won the game by pinning a racist comment on a non-racist in Clay. It's just all really bad and icky, and the fact that this almost cost Brian the win when he dominated the game the way he did is such a bad look. And just in general, Clay had 3 locked votes for at least being somewhat sociable, while Brian didn't give a crap about any of those people out there. So yes, Brian simply dominated the game, but I can't overlook the fact that he almost lost to Clay. But while that's a massive flaw, it's still not as big of a knock as Yule's super idol, which is why he's a couple spots ahead of him at number 11. Now here we are at the top 10, and at number 10, we have a player who almost ruined Winners at War, but absolutely destroyed San Juan del Sur, and that of course is Natalie Anderson. And man, that endgame is something that we might never see again, with just how perfectly she played it. So first off, it's not great that she only attended 1 tribal council to the pre-merge, and the fact that her sister was eliminated first gave her a much easier path to the finish line, and then to start off the merge, she gets blindsided by her alliance and loses her number 1 ally. But what's so great about this is that similar to Sophie, she doesn't panic and make an unnecessary move. In fact, she's the one to get John to play his idol the very next tribal, which, kept the majority alliance intact. But from the final 7 on, she plays some of the best Survivor of all time, switching her vote from Keith to Alec, to which she fooled John and Jacqueline of, and then was the one to control the John blindside at the final 6 with an idol in his pocket. Then, she broke up the last couple in the game while at the same time putting herself in danger by not using the idol on herself, but using it on Jacqueline after she just blindsided her boyfriend at the previous tribal. Then at the final 4, when she wasn't immune, the people who had just lost their family members because of Natalie took her to the end over Keith, even though Natalie was actually a bigger jury threat than the level of Keith, and Misty and Jacqueline knew that too, but they wanted to take Natalie to the end just because they had a better bond with her, again despite her literally taking out their family members. Just unbelievable. The fact that Natalie was able to do the things that she did in this endgame while at the same time having the trust of the people who are getting blindsided by her is just incredible in my opinion. So while her endgame is easily the best endgame in Survivor history, her game before that is average with some minor breaks along the way. So because of all of this, she lands here at number 10. Now at number 9, we have not only one of the most dominant winners, but one of the most beloved winners in Survivor history, and that is Tom Westman, winner of Survivor Palau. And I debate on how much I should penalize him for, pretty much having a free ride to the final 9. But to me, he was the one who provided the food, be the leader of Koror, and the centerpiece on why they dominated the game. And even if it was, say, a 6-3 numbers game going to the merge, I still think he gets to the final 4 pretty easily since there was still no idols. And he won 5 immunities, which of course is still tied with an all-time record. And what's great to me is that he won those immunities when he didn't have to, and then he also won those immunities when he did in fact need them at the final 4 and final 3. And he was in command of his tribe throughout the game, with only Ian ever rallying the troops against him, and by that time it was far too late. So while in a way it was almost an easy ride to the end for Tom, you have to give him credit for the leader type persona he gave to his tribe, and rallied them to take out the on paper better Oolong tribe. He also controlled a bunch of blindsides too at the merge on likes of Colby and Gray, and stopped the Koror girls from forming an all-girls alliance with Stephanie at the final 7. So to me, while there is a slice of penalties I will give him due to only turning 1 tribal counts to the pre-merge, and not having to deal with any idols advantages, he still controlled the dominant Koror tribe, was able to master plenty of blindsides, and is one of the biggest challenge beats in Survivor history, so he lands here at number 9. Now we move on to the most recent newbie winner, but could already be seen as one of the most forgettable in Survivor history. But the thing is, I see far too many people downplaying his game due to his lackluster personality and the season he was on, and that is Tommy Sheenan. And yes, Tommy is not interested in TV in the slightest, as he intentionally made himself boring, but you had to give him some credit for winning Survivor the way he did in season 39. To start, he was basically the centerpiece of the Vokai tribe, and going into the swap he was in a good position, as he and the original Vokai had the plan in motion to blindside Aaron in a 4-2-2 vote. Unfortunately, new era Survivor took control, as Elaine was granted a block of vote, which gave the 4 original Laro the motives to stick together and vote out Jason. One of his big flaws in his game does come after this, as Laura and Tommy tried to target Dan, to which the Laro didn't want, and wanted to break up Laura and Tommy instead. Now the question is who goes home in this spot. I'm inclined to believe it would have been Lauren because again, Tommy was just so freaking liked out there by everyone. But even if it would have been him going home, again, he should never been in that spot to begin with, so I can't take away too much for him for being in the bad position that he was in. Then at the merge, he regained control, and he and Lauren were the centerpieces of the big alliance that was against the Jamals, Noras, Kellys, and Karishmas of the world. Then there was a clear blindside set up for Tommy at the final 8, but Dean of all people who he had just met at the merge saved him and flipped the game on Karishma. Again, great social gameplay from Tommy to get someone like Dean to save him so late in the game, despite being such a massive threat. And at the final 4, he convinced Norwich not even put him in the Fire Making Challenge, despite being a threat to win. Plus, he beats pretty much everyone in the end game. Even against Jenna, I think it's pretty close. I mean, I don't know. It's probably, again, a 5-5 tie, 6-4, either way. It's a really, really close vote. Even against someone as sweet as Janet. I mean, we saw out there what a lovable person she was. That's just how much respected Tommy was out there. And then probably the most impressive of them all, he was able to survive a tribe shuffle, which put 4 original Laro ladies against him, and he was able to get Elaine and Karishma on his side to vote out Missy. So while I'm not a big fan of him not winning any immunities, he played great when he was at the top, and played just as good when he is in trouble. And again, the only times he was ever in trouble was due to game twist, not anything to do with Tommy. And so I'm sorry, the people who are putting him as a low tier or even bottom 10 winner are just ridiculous, as Tommy's game is so impressive, especially considering all the twists in Island of the Idols, which is why he lands here at number 8. Now we go to one of the most cutthroat old school winners in Survivor history, and that is the winner of Survivor China, Todd Herzog. And these final 7 winners I consider to be the real top tier of all these dominating winners, this entire list in general. Todd just has the most flaws out of these 7. He started off in Feilong in not only a dominant position, but a comfortable one as well, as he implemented the meat shield strategy perfectly, hiding behind big threats like James and Aaron, while also having easy votes in front of him like Denise and Courtney. So he breezed to the merge and continued to play hard when he got there, first by getting rid of JR at 9 when he showed that he was willing to flip, and just in general, he didn't trust John Rivera. Now, a couple flaws I do have is that I think they should have blindsided James at the next vote rather than 7, as there was a far greater chance he would have played at least one of his idols, and I think it was more of Amanda's plan to blindside James and convince him he was safe, as opposed to Todd. And while James didn't play his idols, obviously, if he did, Todd very likely could have been voted out, had Eric not stupidly voted for James as well. And the fact that going into Tribal Council, he wasn't going to win. Now, credit where credit's due for pulling off the best final Tribal Council performance ever, But it's not great that going in, people like Courtney and Amanda were bigger threats than him to win, despite him obviously playing a much more dominant game. So while Todd played a dominant game and was responsible for some massive moves, there was a couple of times in the game where he came too close to losing. So for me, that keeps him out of the top 5 and ultimately land here at 7. Now at 6, we have the first winning game of the best player in Survivor history, and that is of course Tony Vlachos in Survivor Cagayan. And while I'm not sure how it would have gone had the bronze gone to the first couple of tribal councils, he obviously found his way into the majority with Trish, Wu, and of course Sarah a week or so into the game. Then at the tribe swap, he made the flip to vote out Cliff, and was a central figure to keep the Solana tribe together through the merge. And this is where the only real downside of Tony's game is, as at the final 11 he wasted his idol, and it was more of Trish's doing to get Class to flip as opposed to him, as if Class didn't flip, more than likely he doesn't win the game. But with the flip, he basically controlled who went home each night, whether it was a Solana member, or if it was the blind side of someone in his alliance, such as LJ and Jeffra. And he did this so strategically as well, as despite being viewed as untrustworthy, people like Cass and Trish had no incentive to flip, because they would have no chance against the underdogs like Tasha and Spencer, as opposed to at least a fighting chance against Tony. I mean, he just did a great job of keeping the big, shields around. He used his super idol to perfection as leverage, but even then he never needed it, and yet still managed to switch from side to side depending on what benefited his game. And at the final 3, where he looked to be a dead man walking, he convinced Wu it was the right thing to do to take him to the final 2, and unbelievably got Wu to take him over Cass. Tony did such a magnificent job of using his idols to his advantage and flipping from side to side, yet never becoming a target himself. It's just a masterful game, and if it wasn't for his bad gameplay at the final 11, he would easily have 2 games in the top 5. Now at number 5, we have a winner who most people consider the best winner in Survivor history, especially before Winners at War aired, but to me, I just can't overlook the cast she played with, and that is Kim Spradlin. And yeah, I mean, she dominated the game probably better than anyone else, including people like Rob and the people above her on this list. I mean, she probably can make her case for she's the most dominant winner. She literally had all the options in the world to play with, wins against anybody, and won 4 immunities to top it all off. But again, the big problem, in my opinion, is that she was playing with one of the worst, if not the worst newbie cast of all time. I mean, the men of one word literally gave up immunity to do what Cole and freaking Cumby wanted. Christina was completely out of it out there as production didn't allow her medicine. Alicia was completely messed up and delusional. And as we saw in the vote, even a decent player like Sabrina and Chelsea stood no chance next to Kim. Now again, this is a newbie cast, so I'm not gonna penalize too much like other returning player winners, and I'm not gonna look at an IQ test to really compare. Oh, this really was a smart cast compared to that cast, so Kim deserves the credit. I mean, I'm not gonna go that far, but I think we can all agree it's clear that this is one of the worst casts of all time. And so while most people, would argue that Kim deserves a top spot, or at least a top 2 spot, for me, I will have to penalize her just a little bit, so she lands here number 5. Now, at number 4, we have someone who, as an overall player, he's probably bottom tier, but this person undoubtedly played one of the best winning games in Survivor history, and that is JT, winner of Survivor Tokachins. And the big knock I would have against JT is that he did need Steven along the way to help him through the strategic part of the game, and I think this showed in his next 2 appearances. But my goodness, this guy was viewed as God's gift out there by the players, to the point where people would rather see him win than themselves, and that just speaks to the level of socialness and respect he had out there. He was the absolute leader of his tribe, and obviously one of Survivor's best competitors, winning 3 beauties. And again, credit to the other part of the cast, like Steven, Aaron, and Taj, for realizing what a big threat he was, unlike people in other seasons who couldn't see what an obvious threat the winner was. But they obviously couldn't take him out, as JT clutched up and won those final 2 immunities. And it has some subtle strategic moves as well, like giving Coach his vote the final 5, knowing he was still going home, but won that jury vote. His absolute dominance over Steven at the final trial council, just in general, his final trial council performance was absolutely incredible. And I guess my one other knock is, how would the final 10 round go? I think there might have been a chance that Timbira sticks together for at least 1 vote before turning on each other, and JT could have been in danger there without immunity. But it's really hard for me to imagine that. I'm not going to penalize that, to be honest. So in the end, JT was pretty much allied and in the good graces of everyone out there. His physical powers, and of course, he got the first perfect game in Survivor history. All that lands him here at number 4. And honestly, had he had a bit of more of a strategic mind over Steven, more than likely he would be number 1. Now, number 3, we have someone who, in my opinion, definitely changed the way most winners nowadays play the game. And that is the winner of Survivor Second Chance, Jeremy Collins. And for me, while the meat shield strategy was always a thing in Survivor, he obviously, revolutionized it in this age of idols and advantages where you always need people in front of you. And he played the meat shield strategy pretty much perfectly, as he aligned himself with the strongest physical players in Tasha and Joe, the smartest player overall in Steven, and the alpha type player in Savage. Then of course he formed a strong bond with Spencer on Bion, which would take them to the end. He played in a strategic as hell season with voting blocks and advantages left and right. And he was a part of some big time moves, like the 3-2-1 Monica vote, the Wigglesworth blindside, and playing as idol in Steven. Now you probably wondered why I'm not penalizing Jeremy as much as other return players. Well, first off, this was obviously an entire group of return players, and second off, while you could argue he was in a decent position to win Cambodia, as again people like Kaz, Savage, Varner, Abby, people like that would never win the season, I think those are really the only players who stood no chance. And Jeremy himself, look at him, he was a massive threat in his own right, and was a massive character on one of the most recent seasons. And even the other players like Joe and Sierra, who you could argue were bigger targets than Jeremy coming in, weren't nearly as overpoweringly threatening as, say, Ozzy compared to Sarah in Game Changers. And even the old school players who you wouldn't think stood a chance played good games, as people like Kimmy stood a good chance to win if she got to the end, and even tried to pull off the big move on Jeremy at 6, which of course he neglected with the idol. This cast is one of the most strategic in Survivor history, and while I actually do put Jeremy below the number 2 spot on my list for this being his second time, that's really all I can knock him for. And while he only won one immunity, he was intentionally throwing immunities to make himself not a threat, as that was his plan. But he won when it absolutely mattered at the Final Four. So in the end, I think Jeremy played a dominant game on an extremely tough season, and revolutionized the modern game with a meat shield strategy. So he lands here at number 3. Now, number 2, we have a winner that never fails to amaze me at just how easy the game seemed to come to them, and in my opinion, the best newbie winner in Survivor history, and that is the winner of Survivor Fiji, Earl Cole. And yeah, Earl didn't stand out socially wise like JT. He certainly wasn't a challenge piece, as he won 0 immunities, but my goodness, did he dominate the game like no newbie ever has, all while having seen one episode of the show. And that's the thing about Earl, he dominates the game so easily. You could argue that at least Troyzen was trying to take him out. Other winners here in the top 10 needed a challenge win here or there. But Earl didn't need any of that and still flat out dominated the game. And unlike other old school dominant winners, he faced adversity. He started on the horrible Ravu tribe after the terrible Have-Nots twist, and lost his close ally Michele after a ridiculous tribe swap merge twist. And of course, this season featured the first real example of the hidden media idol, which he either played around with his alliance coming up with a safe vote plan, or he used to his advantage, as him and Yao Man both had an idol that they used as leverage throughout the game, and ultimately the two of them were responsible for the first ever successful idol play on Stacy. And through this whole time of ups and downs and bad twists, Earl was always in control of the game, whether it was on the old Ravu, New Moto, or the merged Bula Bula tribe. He dominated the game along with Yao Man. It was never a target with him as a shield. But the amazing part is that Earl beats the level of Yao Man in a jury vote, which is just so crazy. Like, Yao Man's a guy you would think would always win a jury vote, especially when you factor in he played a great game. But that just goes to show how great Earl's game was, since he beats Yao and anyone in the end. So while Earl is a bit of an anomaly on my list, as he didn't do anything super strategic or physical, the fact that he was on top from beginning to end, was never a target, and beats anyone in the end, all while not even going to be on the show 24 hours prior, is just absolutely insane to me. And that, in my mind, makes him the best newbie winner of all time. Now, number 1, the most recent winner and the second winning game of the greatest player in Survivor history. Of course, I'm talking about Tony Vlacho's game in Survivor Winners at War. And come on, of course it is. And you could argue that some winners played a bit better, but Tony still played incredible despite this being an all-winner season. And the fact that he had such a massive target in and still won is incredible. As we've seen, usually with every other returning player winner, they're usually one of the best spots to win, while Tony was in one of the worst. Now, to be fair, I do think looking back, he did have a better shot than a lot of players out there. Like, some people even thought he would be the biggest target of them all, but obviously people like Sandra, Robin Amber, and Parvati were never going to win this season, and I think had much bigger targets on their backs. Ethan with his storyline you couldn't let near the end, and of course he had Sarah by his side pretty much all season, a phenomenal player in her own right, who was never going to turn on Tony. So yeah, I think he had a much better chance than some players out there who we thought would have a much better chance than Tony. But still, he was in pretty much the bottom quartile of players to win, and the top of targets, and he still freaking dominated the game. Now, he didn't really dominate the Richard DeCall tribe, as he wanted Tyson to stay, and apparently he was next to go, but to be fair, I think a tribe swap was almost 100% certain in this age of Survivor, so I won't penalize him for that. And he obviously wasn't in a dominant position on the new to call at the swap, but that's because he was literally the only person at that point without a safety net, as Sandra, Kim, and Denise all had idols, and Jeremy could have left tribal any time. So obviously he didn't do anything to turn the tables. He still made it past the tribal when he literally could have been the only choice to go home. But then at the merge, he simply dominated, despite being without question the biggest target there. He won 4 immunities in the fire making challenge. He played probably the best 3 days in Survivor history during the Sophie blindside, led the charge on Kim, Jeremy, and Nick votes, and was never really in danger, with his name not being written down one time all season. Just crazy. In general, for Tony to even win the game despite being Tony on an all-winner season, much less doing it while dominating the merge and winning 4 immunities, he is without question the best player in Survivor history, and there's no doubt in my mind this is the best winning game in Survivor history, and obviously he deserves a spot at number 1. So there you have it, guys, my ranking of all 40 winning games in Survivor history. Keep in mind this is all my opinion, it's completely subjective, not objective, as I'm sure you guys realize that. I mean, the comments for videos like these are always so civil and respectful of the person's opinion. But either way, I appreciate it if you hit that like button, as this video did take a long time to make, and share it with all your Survivor friends, as you know, these videos and rankings are always fun to debate over. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well for more Survivor content. Have a good one, guys.